now we're going to be moving on to sleep. So in this section, we're going to be thinking about sleep, whether your child struggles with attention, anxiety, sensory sensitivities, or emotional regulation. Sleep plays a critical role in every single one of these areas. Sleep is not a luxury. It isn't something nice to have. It's a biological necessity that affects every system in our bodies. For children, sleep supports brain development and memory, hormone balance and growth, and a healthy immune system. It also includes emotional stability and focus. Okay, so when children don't get enough quality sleep, we often see difficulties in all the areas we're trying to improve. So all the areas that I've mentioned, I know from my personal experience that have a massive impact for my children. When children don't get enough sleep, we often see the difficulties, like I've mentioned. And these are all the areas that we're trying to improve. So attention, we're trying to improve, anxiety, we're trying to improve, emotional regulation, and even academic performance. So we know sleep can have an impact on schooling as well as home life. Okay, so how does the body decide when to sleep? The brain uses two main systems to manage the shift between being awake and asleep. These are known as process S and process C. Think of process S as sleep pressure, that growing sense of tiredness that builds the longer you're awake. This happens because of a chemical called adenosine, which gradually accumulates in the brain during the day. The rule: when sleep pressure is high, it's easier to fall asleep. Once you're asleep, that pressure decreases quickly. Now, the second system is process C, or your child's internal clock, what's also called the circadian rhythm. This is a natural 24-hour cycle that determines when your child feels alert or sleepy. It's mainly influenced by light exposure and the hormone melatonin. When light enters the eyes, melatonin production is suppressed, keeping your child alert. And when the light fades, melatonin begins to rise, usually about 2 hours before your child's usual bedtime. That's the body's way of signalling that it's time to wind down. But here's the key. It's essential to fall asleep when both systems work together, when sleep pressure, so process S, is high, and alertness, process C, is naturally decreasing. It's much easier to adjust sleep pressure than it is to change the internal clock. But exposure to natural sunlight, especially in the morning, is the most powerful way to shift that internal rhythm. Right, so that's the part around sleep. We know that. We also know that our children, I'm including myself in there, can really struggle with sleep. So we're going to connect it to sensory processing, as there is a strong link between poor sleep and sensory difficulties, and it works both ways. It's a cycle. So to fall asleep smoothly, a child needs to be in what we call an optimum range of arousal, so not overstimulated, not understimulated, but calm and regulated. However, for children with sensory processing challenges, that's often hard to achieve after a full day of sensory input, so sounds, lights, textures, movements. They may be in a state of high arousal or sensory overload. So research shows us that sleep challenges are reported in up to 80% of autistic children, and that children with poor sleep and those with sensory challenges share similar brain differences. These children often experience higher stress levels and larger spikes in cortisol, which is the body's stress hormone, when exposed to sensory stimuli. And there's another piece. The brain needs to filter out unimportant sensory input. So do you remember at the beginning I mentioned about that fan when you're walking into a room, that it's those with sensory that haven't got sensory processing difficulties, it can filter out that as irrelevant, but somebody with sensory processing difficulties may hold on to that. So it's recognised it as something that it needs to hold on to. But not only that, so not only the sounds, we're also thinking about things like if the child's been sitting all day and they're sensitive to tactile, they might have been processing that tactile, so that touch, so sitting in the chair, the back of the chair, they might have been processing that information as well, so that's added to that. So when that filtering doesn't work properly, so think about all those things, the chair, the fan, and that's really small, isn't it? I've just mentioned just a few really small things there. So when that filtering doesn't work properly, the brain continues to register all those tiny sensations as distractions, and that makes it much harder to settle down and to fall asleep. Then on the flip side of that, when a child doesn't sleep well, their sensory processing tends to worsen the next day. So that's where we're talking about that cycle. They might become more reactive to sounds, textures, or movement, partly because their nervous system is already under stress from insufficient rest. So poor sleep leads to sensory difficulties, and those difficulties in turn make it harder to sleep. A vicious cycle that needs to be addressed from both sides. So supporting sensory regulation and improving sleep routines and sleep hygiene. Okay, so the difficulties can be around actually falling asleep. They can also be around staying asleep, and all that can be impacted by their experiences throughout the day because of that sensory information that's being processed. So I mentioned I've got 3 children, but 2 of which are autistic. Both of my autistic children really struggle with sleep. One struggles to stay asleep throughout the night, and actually when they were really little, they used to get up in the night and play because they hadn't really got any concept of time, and so they would get their Lego out in the middle of the night, and I'd have to go in there and explain, it's still night time, it's time to go back into bed. And we found that was impacting their everyday life at school because they were really tired, and sometimes they would, especially in the early years, they would be and after lunch they'd be wanting to have a nap, falling asleep whilst trying to do some work, and it's because of the difficulties around sleep and actually being able to stay asleep. For my youngest, the sleep challenges are slightly different. For her, it's about being able to go to sleep, being able to fall asleep initially. And from a very young age, we'd find she would have dragged the little mattress off her bed and have put it into one of her siblings' rooms, dragged it across out of her room onto their bedroom floor, because she felt more grounded when she was sleeping on the floor. And also she hated being on her own. She's really sensitive to the environment around her, and she doesn't like to be on her own even now, and she's older, she's a teenager now. And so the sensory sensitivities created anxieties, and those anxieties then impacted on her ability to be able to fall asleep. So from a parent perspective, I absolutely understand these challenges, but remember, it's small steps, small progress in our household. We celebrate those small wins. So let's think about then some strategies that possibly could help. So again, it's about being a detective, being your own detective. You know your home environment best. You know your child's home environment. So thinking about, is there anything in the room? Okay, let's think for a minute then about the environment, about the space where your child sleeps. We'll think about that just prior to then thinking about some strategies to support. Okay, so think in your mind as I'm talking through about your specific home environment, thinking about the child that comes to mind that potentially struggles with sleep. Think about their space. Think about the colours. Is it quite bright? Is there lots of toys? Is there lots of bits of not clutter, because it's things that your child, I'm sure, really loves, but is there lots of things around? Is there anything that when the lights turn out and it goes dark, that actually might feel quite intimidating or look quite intimidating? So, for example, we've got in the window on the image on the slide of a teddy. Okay, it could be a really soft, cuddly teddy, and you think that's the cutest thing ever in the daylight. But actually, does that cast a shadow in the dark that might be quite intimidating? Is there anything in there that might be letting in the light from outside? So particularly in the summer months where it gets dark later, are the curtains really, really thin, or maybe you haven't got curtains at blinds, for example? Is there a gap around there that is letting the light in? So go in to your child's room and have a look around, have a look together, get them involved and see if there's anything that you think could be impacting. So you can take a screenshot of this slide here now. So you can take this home as you're going around your room as a few different prompts to reflect on. So think about the temperature. Is the temperature in the room too hot, or is it too cold? Are there noises coming in from outside that possibly you can't do anything about? But it might be something to consider when you're thinking about putting, the bigger picture all together. All right, so let's think about some strategies specifically then. So the actual going to sleep, that's sort of like the final part in the process. We remember when we spoke about toileting, we broke the task down. We need to do that with sleep as well. So the actual winding down sleep process begins a lot sooner than the actual getting into bed, going to sleep. So again, you can create visual schedules. Again, get your child involved. They might have a favourite character that they absolutely love. They might love a Marvel character or a Lego character. Use that. Use your child's interest to your advantage to be able to create those visual schedules. Or use your child, get them involved. Use pictures of them, perhaps winding down, doing an activity that they love just prior to bed. So visual schedules are really good for predictable, consistent routines to support anxieties around your children potentially knowing what next. The other thing that I would encourage is have some wind down time, some physical wind down time too. So, for example, if you think about a baby and we're trying to get a baby to sleep, we'll do that gentle rocking motion. Imagine they're in your arms and you're gently rocking them to sleep. So a rocking motion is quite soothing to be able to settle the central nervous system, to comfort it, to settle it down, ready for sleep. If we think about a baby and we want to sort of wake them up, we want to help them to become a little bit more alert, we might bounce them on our knee, jumping up and down and say, come on now, whatever it is that you're doing, and you're trying to wake them up. So that bouncing motion is alerting. That helps them to wake up. So we want to try and discourage from bouncing, and we want to encourage rocking. Okay. The other thing to think about is any calming activities. So if we're giving a child an activity to do before bed, my tip or area of caution is to make sure that they can complete that task. So if, for example, they're doing a puzzle, but it's quite a tricky puzzle and they've only got 10 minutes to do it, and the likelihood is they're not going to be able to complete that task, I would maybe direct them or encourage them to do something else prior to bed, because what could happen is they get to a point where they're frustrated because they can't then finish something that in their minds they wanted to finish. So whatever the wind down task is that you're doing, I would encourage you to allow time for them to complete that task. Gentle music, again, music can be really calming and soothing. So there's steps to do just prior to getting into bed. Then you're then going to be thinking about the actual physical environment of the bedroom. So that's where you'll then go back to that previous slide and be your own detective. In our household, we every single room in the house, everybody sleeps with a fan, and it's that white noise. So even in the cold winter months, the fans are all going in every single room, and it's because it's that soothing, consistent sound. So sometimes noise can be triggering if it's not consistent. So for the fan, it's a consistent sound, and it takes away the silence that can sometimes be a little bit unnerving. And actually, in our household now, what happens is we have to take portable fans even on holiday with us, because everyone's so used to that white noise, the noise of the fan, that nobody can sleep when we go away if we haven't got that noise going. So actually, just bear that in mind if you are introducing something like a fan. If you do then go and stay somewhere else, it might be worth investing in a portable fan. And that helps for consistency, I guess, when you're going somewhere new as well. So like I said, you know your rooms, you know your children, whether they're auditory sensitive or whether it's that they need to be really snuggled in tight because they like tight hugs. So it might be the bedding that you want to just sort of consider. Outside noise, like I said, it might not be something that you can necessarily do anything about, but introducing the fan may dull, or some form of white noise, it doesn't have to be a fan, might then end up dulling the sound from outside, and it's that consistent, predictable sound that they can hear, as opposed to the unpredictability of the road noise.